Welcome, dear friends, to an extraordinary episode where we will reveal one of the most powerful and practically revolutionary secrets that Chanakya, the genius strategist of ancient India, had discovered about human nature. The existence of three specific words that, when used in certain particular ways in everyday speech, instantly expose any liar, no matter how skilled, sophisticated or convincing they may appear on the surface. This extraordinary discovery was not the product of theoretical speculation or abstract philosophy, but the result of decades of meticulous observation, systematic analysis and practical application in the most treacherous and politically dangerous environments in ancient history, where the ability to distinguish between truth and lies could literally mean the difference between life and death, between the triumph of an empire and its total destruction. Chanakya, also known as Kautilya, had developed this method during his time as chief advisor to Emperor Chandragupta Maurya, when he navigated daily through the complex intrigues of the royal court, diplomatic negotiations with enemy kingdoms, and the constant threats of betrayal, both internal and external, that characterized the politics of his era. What makes this discovery absolutely extraordinary is that these three specific words completely transcend cultural, linguistic, and temporal barriers. They work equally effectively in any language, in any culture, and in any historical period, because they are based on fundamental and universal psychological patterns of human behavior. When people attempt to hide the truth or fabricate false information, the first revealing word that Chanakya had identified as a universal indicator of deception is the word really, and its equivalents in other languages such as truly, honestly, sincerely, or any adverb that emphasizes the veracity of what is being said. This observation may seem paradoxical at first, because intuitively we might expect honest people to be more prone to emphasizing their honesty. But Chanakya had discovered exactly the opposite. Through years of careful observation, he had noticed that people who tell the truth rarely feel the compulsive psychological need to constantly emphasize that they are being honest, precisely because their honesty is natural, authentic, and does not require artificial reinforcement. Truth, according to Chanakya, stands on its own and does not need verbal crutches to appear credible. Liars, on the contrary, unconsciously understand that what they are saying is not true, and this internal psychological tension drives them to overcompensate by adding verbal emphasis to their false statements. It is as if their subconscious mind tried to convince both the listener and themselves of the veracity of their fabricated claims through the repetition of words that reinforce the idea of honesty. Chanakya had observed that the more frequently someone used these emphasis words in a conversation, especially when they had not been challenged or questioned, the more likely they were to be fabricating at least part of the information they were sharing. This pattern was especially evident when people began statements with phrases like, "Honestly, I tell you, it really happened that way," or "I sincerely believe that," without anyone having questioned their credibility. The second key word that Chanakya had identified as a universal revealer of deception is always, and its counterpart never, along with other absolutes like all, nothing, everyone, nobody. These words represent what he called defensive absolutes, and he had observed that liars have a marked tendency to use absolutist language when describing situations, behaviors, or events they are fabricating or distorting. The psychological reason behind this pattern is fascinating. When people lie, especially about personal behaviors or characteristics, they feel an unconscious need to make their false claims seem more convincing and less questionable. Linguistic absolutes serve this purpose because they create the illusion of total clarity and eliminate any gray areas that might invite more questions or investigation. Chanakya had noticed that honest people, when describing real situations, naturally tend to use more nuanced and precise language that reflects the inherent complexity of reality. They say things like, "I usually do," It rarely happens, most of the time, or on some occasions, because real life is full of exceptions, variations and specific circumstances. Liars, however, create fictional worlds that are simpler and more absolute than reality, because it is easier to maintain consistency in a simple narrative than in a complex one. When someone says, "I never did that," "I always act this way," or "everyone knows I'm like that," they are frequently trying to close the door to any additional investigation by creating a statement that seems to admit no exceptions. Chanakya had developed the ability to detect these absolutist statements and then ask specific follow-up questions that explored the natural exceptions that should exist if the person were being completely honest. Liars often found themselves caught in inconsistencies when asked to provide specific details about their absolute statements, the third revealing word that Chanakya considered as the most subtle but most definitive indicator of deception is "I think," and its variations like "I believe." It seems to me, I suppose, I imagine, when used specifically in contexts where the person should have direct knowledge and certainty about what they are describing. This observation is particularly sophisticated because it requires contextual analysis. Chanakya had noticed that when people lie about events they supposedly experienced directly, situations they were present in, or information they should know with certainty, they unconsciously tend to use tentative language that subconsciously reflects the uncertainty of their fabricated narrative. It is as if their honest mind tried to find a moral escape by creating psychological distance between themselves and the lie they are telling. By saying, "I think it happened that way," instead of "it happened that way," they are technically not lying about their belief. Although they are lying about the events they describe, Chanakya had observed that honest people describing real experiences they personally lived tend to use direct and definitive language. "I saw this. I heard that. I was there when it happened." They only use tentative language when there is genuinely real uncertainty about specific details or when they are making legitimate interpretations of ambiguous events. Liars, on the contrary, use this tentative language as an unconscious strategy of psychological protection, especially when they are inventing specific details about events that never occurred or significantly distorting what really happened. What makes this discovery truly revolutionary is that Chanakya had developed specific methods to use these three revealing words strategically during conversations, to unmask lies in a subtle but effective way. It was not simply about passively listening for these words, but about creating conversational situations where liars would be forced to use them if they were being dishonest. For example, when he suspected that someone was lying to him about a specific event, Chanakya would develop the conversation in such a way that the person had multiple opportunities to provide additional details. Liars, under this subtle pressure, would begin to overload themselves with words like "really," "always," and "I think," because their subconscious anxiety about being discovered would make them verbally overcompensate. Chanakya had also developed what he called inversion questions, where he would deliberately introduce small inconsistencies or incorrect details about the story the person had told, observing how they responded. Honest people would immediately correct any misunderstanding because they had clear and precise memories of what had really occurred. Liars, however, would often accept the incorrect versions or use the three revealing words while trying to navigate through the confusion between their original fabricated narrative and the new elements that Chanakya had introduced. Now, the genius of this system lay in its universality and subtlety. Chanakya could apply these techniques during apparently casual conversations without the other person realizing they were being evaluated. This allowed him to obtain crucial information about the honesty and reliability of people without creating direct confrontation or revealing his suspicions. During his time as royal advisor, Chanakya used these techniques to identify enemy spies, disloyal counselors, fraudulent merchants, and diplomats who were providing false information during negotiations. His ability to detect lies using these three simple words gave him an extraordinary strategic advantage that contributed significantly to the success of the Mauryan Empire. It is important to understand that these techniques should not be used in a paranoid or destructive way in our daily personal relationships. Chanakya taught that true wisdom includes knowing when to apply these methods and when to simply trust people. These tools are designed for situations where there are legitimate reasons to suspect deception, or where the consequences of being deceived could be significant. In our modern world, these techniques can be invaluable for professionals who need to assess honesty in job interviews, business negotiations, investigations, or any situation where distinguishing between truth and lies has important consequences. They can also be useful for protecting ourselves from scammers, manipulators, or people who might be taking advantage of our good faith. The practical application of these principles requires practice and discernment. It is important to observe patterns rather than judge isolated statements. Consider the cultural and personal context of each individual, and remember that these are evaluation tools, not definitive proof of deception. Chanakya reminds us that the ultimate goal of developing these skills is not to become cynical or distrustful, but to protect our energy, resources, and well-being so that we can invest them in authentic relationships and legitimate enterprises. The ability to detect lies allows us to be more generous and trusting with those who deserve our trust, because we have the security of knowing that we can identify those who do not deserve it. This millennial wisdom of Chanakya about the three revealing words represents a powerful tool for navigating the complexity of modern human relationships with greater intelligence, protection, and effectiveness, allowing us to create more authentic, secure, and prosperous lives based on genuine connections and informed decisions.